On behalf of Wilmington College in Southwest Ohio in Wilmington, Ohio, I welcome you back to the 30th annual Westheimer Peace Symposium, focusing on peace and the nature of war through a special two-day symposium entitled The Nuclear Threat, Past, Present, and Future, in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. This year's symposium is a special collaboration with the Wilmington College Peace Resource Center, which holds an extensive collection of archival materials related to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the human experience of nuclear war. It is also held in collaboration with the Response Project, and which is funded by an Ohio Arts Council grant. The Response Project is a conception of Brianna Matsky, musical faculty of Wilmington College, in which 7 artists across the United States have created original compositions for the symposium in response to archival materials from the Peace Resource Center archives. For other Response Project series, please go to the Response Project website. For a full schedule of today's and tomorrow's, for today's lectures, actually, I just realized we're at the end of the symposium. I guess I don't want it to end. Please, if you'd like to see the events that took place over the last couple days, please go to wilmington.edu/Westheimer. Over the past couple days, we've had the wonderful opportunity to hear from numerous speakers, artists, composers, poets, photographers and filmmakers, among others, about why weapons of mass destruction, such as nuclear weapons, are no longer a suitable way for human beings to deal with their personal, national, global conflicts, and why we need to move towards strategic methods of nonviolence as a means to resolve these conflicts. Tonight, we will culminate these conversations in our keynote address. Before we turn to that keynote address, I would like to present some comments from Bill Westheimer of the Westheimer family, who made this symposium possible for the past 30 years.
I'm Bill Westheimer. I'm the middle child of May and Charles Westheimer's 5 children. It's often been said that the middle child is the peacemaker of the family, and I have occasionally found myself in that position. But the reality is they taught us to get along with each other and with others. It's a testament to how they raised us and how they lived. Speaking for my family, I thank Wilmington College for sustaining our parents' desire to make the world a better place by encouraging peace between peoples and nations. Thanks to Tanya Moss for asking me to speak and organizing this wonderful event. Thanks to all the presenters, the workshop leaders, and the participants for making this initiative a meaningful experience and working to bring peace to humanity. Growing up in the 1950s, I experienced the post-World War II attempt to make sense of the new nuclear technologies and how it would affect war and peace. I learned early about the dangers of nuclear war as our school basement was turned into a civil defense shelter. We were taught about the wonders, but not the risks and dangers of nuclear power. Over time, the true reality of these nuclear technologies was slowly realized. Thanks to people like our symposium presenters, these realities have been made clear and a way forward is being defined. Through their hard work and leadership, we can work towards a safer and saner planet, which was my parents' deeply held wish. I want to finish by sharing a glimpse into who my parents were and how they lived. They were actively involved in the International Visitors Center at the University of Cincinnati, where we lived. We were a host family for foreign students and faculty. My parents loved to invite their newfound foreign friends to holiday events, weekend activities, and fully engage them into our family. We shared our lives and culture with them, and they shared theirs with us. Some are close friends to this day. My parents kept in touch with many of them even after they left UC. Letters were mailed back and forth and news shared. Students returned home, became parents, and had their own families. My parents loved knowing the news of what was going on in Greece, Sweden, China, Iran, and scores of other countries where their students had returned to. My mother saved all of those exotic postage stamps and collaged them into placemats, which I still use today. Looking at them, I can remember the individuals and think of the difference my parents made in their lives and how they enriched our lives. Perhaps the most revealing legacy of hosting international students was a round-the-world trip my mother took to visit their international family. May, then in her senior years, packed only a small carry-on bag and set off. Charles was disabled and stayed home, but she visited numerous countries and slept on the couches and in the guest rooms of her international families. She had no interest in hotels or restaurants. She wanted that family experience. It brought her great joy to be with her international families and experiencing how they had contributed to international relationships and understanding. It would also bring them great joy if they knew how this peace symposium had been sustained for 30 years by Wilmington College and the participants. On behalf of my family, we say thank you and wish you peace.
Thank you so much, Bill. We are so thankful that you and Mary were able to join us this year and provide us some comments. My name is Tanya Moss. I'm the director of the Peace Resource Center at Wilmington College, and I'm your host for this evening's keynote address entitled Abolishing Nuclear Weapons Through Humanitarian Disarmament, a Fight for Us All. In my role as host, I welcome you here. I'll briefly introduce our keynote speaker, and I'll be on hand to help field questions when needed. Before I turn to our keynote speaker, I'd like to extend our thanks to the many individuals who made this symposium possible. We're a small college here in Wilmington with about 1,000 students, and each person, whether it was faculty, staff, or student, who contributed to bringing this symposium about, took on something very extra above and beyond their already extensive duties of teaching and service here at the college, and we thank them. First of all, I'd like to thank the Westheimer Committee. I'd like to thank our interim president, Erica Goodwin, and her staff for their ongoing support of the symposium. Thank you also to our devoted Peace Resource Center and Quaker Heritage Center student staff for their constant support, patience, and willingness to help in any way. And then finally, a special thank you to the Westheimer family. With Charles and May's generous endowment of this symposium in 1999, without it, we would not be able to carry on this annual symposium, which unifies our college around its core Quaker values of peace, social justice, integrity, respect for all persons, civic engagement, and community. And it also allows us to express those values through vital talks and workshops and performances to our community. A special thank you to Mary and Bill, who provided comments. We are so fortunate to have this opportunity to celebrate and strive toward peace by gaining awareness and knowledge each year at the Westheimer Peace Symposium. And of course, last but not least, a huge thank you goes to our technical support team. Now, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our keynote speaker this evening, Carlos Umania. Dr. Umania is a member of the International Steering Group of ICAN, or the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and he is president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and the Costa Rica and TPNW Regional Vice President for Latin America. A former health manager with the Costa Rican Ministry of Health, his medical background includes work in primary care and specialized care as a resident in obstetrics and gynecology. Aside from his medical background, he has also studied fine arts at the University of Costa Rica and is currently studying for a master's degree in vegetarian nutrition and works as a medical translator and visual artist. Dr. Umania has worked closely with the Costa Rican Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with other local, regional, and global organizations for peace, human rights, and nuclear disarmament. Dr. Umania, I will turn this over to you. Thank you very much.
In 2006, IPPNW founded ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, a coalition of now over 540 organizations in over 100 countries. ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 in recognition of our work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and to our groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of said weapons. This is humanitarian disarmament, and it is a process that places the people at the center of the discussions regarding nuclear weapons. It is by raising awareness on their effects on people that change is being made. Now, the world faces two existential threats: climate change and nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are called weapons of mass destruction because they do not discriminate between military and civilian targets and destroy everything in their path. The other four weapons of mass destruction are chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions. Currently, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, China, France, Great Britain, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. And together, they possess approximately 13,500 nuclear weapons, of which 1,800 remain in a state of high alert, that is, pointing at cities, ready to be detonated within minutes. Nuclear weapons exist since 1945 and have been used twice during warfare over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, there have been 2,057 more detonations during nuclear weapons tests carried out in Pacific nations, the Australian outback, the Nevada desert, Algeria, North Korea, Kazakhstan, and other places. The data on the humanitarian impact of these weapons has been obtained from the victims of the detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as from the nuclear weapons test sites. Let me begin by saying that nuclear weapons are no ordinary bombs. They're not just like a very big, powerful piece of dynamite. Their effects go far beyond the physical destruction caused by the blast. The devastation caused by these weapons would involve both space and time because they contaminate the land, the water, and life for generations. At large, the consequences of a nuclear detonation derive from the blast, from the heat, and from the ionizing radiation, which have immediate, short-term, and long-term effects in the local, regional, and global settings. As for the blast wave and associated overpressures and hurricane force winds reduce most buildings and infrastructure to rubble. The heat, in the order of hundreds to thousands of degrees, causes everything near ground zero to evaporate. And beyond it, it causes large areas of coalescent fires that, either by incineration or oxygen depletion, eliminate all forms of life therein. As for ionizing radiation, it can be a part of the detonation itself, or be spread regionally as part of a nuclear fallout. It causes acute and long-term illnesses that are often deadly, as well as genetic and intergenerational health effects. The severity of the acute radiation syndrome, the one occurring with a high dose of penetrating radiation, is proportional to the dose received, and through the degradation and collapse of vital organs, can cause a very painful death within hours, days, or weeks, and those who recover may remain ill for months or even years. In the long term, lower doses of ionizing radiation can cause cancers and other chronic diseases even many years after exposure. Many survivors who presented with no injuries, burns, or who did not become ill initially, after several years began to experience cancers such as leukemia, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, and prostate cancer, among others. The effects of radiation can also carry to the following generations. Those exposed will have a higher risk of bearing children with drastic birth defects, and their progeny will have a higher propensity of suffering from cancer. The survivors of a nuclear attack, in Japanese called hibakusha, will not only have witnessed the horrors of a nuclear detonation, they will not only have lived through their loved ones suffering and dying an atrocious death, they will not only carry the deep emotional scars that this implies, but they will have seen their home, their historic and cultural heritage reduced to rubble, a poisoned rubble. They will live the rest of their days with the fear that the next common cold will be the disease that takes them, and they will suffer a social stigma. In the rest of Japan, the hibakusha were discriminated for several years and even generations. Even if they were healthy and unscathed, people wouldn't hire them because they could fall ill, nor would they marry them because they might bear deformed children. In schools, the hibakusha children were separated from the rest of the children for similar reasons. Some hibakusha even talk about having left Japan to live in remote countries, where no one would know that they were atomic bomb survivors, and would lie about where they came from because they were ashamed. What was once a source of pride, their hometown, had now become a source of shame. Now, as I mentioned before, the nuclear weapons tests also left behind victims. There is, for example, the case of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, where the United States carried out nuclear tests between 1948 and 1953. Today, the Marshall Islands are a sovereign nation, but at the time, they were a protectorate under the United States. The nuclear tests contaminated an earthly paradise and rendered it uninhabitable. Many people were displaced, and many suffered and continue to suffer the consequences of radiation poisoning, with a higher mortality rate, a higher incidence of various cancers, and genetic and birth defects. The same thing happened in other parts of the world. The common denominator? The victims were mostly indigenous people, not rich, not white. They were all told that nuclear weapons tests would not harm them and would not affect their environment, that it would be safe for their health, for fishing and agriculture, and that their lives would go about as usual. Hence, few or no precautions were taken. And these people had no way of knowing that this wasn't true. At the time, the world didn't know about the radiation poisoning that came about with nuclear weapons. The US and Japanese authorities were adamant in hiding the ugly side of the effects of nuclear weapons on people. The Japanese survivors were scrutinized and heavily censored. From medical records to photographs, journals, letters, drawings, or even songs and poems, any evidence that linked nuclear weapons with lingering suffering was confiscated as dangerous material. The humanitarian suffering was something that was deliberately and actively hidden from the world. It was thus that the words atomic and nuclear became synonymous with powerful, prestigious, and strong. Now, clearly, these effects are not history. They are the present. For there are people today who are still suffering from the effects of nuclear weapons. Now let us pause at this moment to reflect a little bit on what life might be like for people with such intense disabilities. Let us think about their caretakers, the healthcare system, and support network needed to guarantee their life with dignity. Let us think about who is in charge of this care and all the hardships that are involved. Now let's imagine this in a poor family of an economically challenged country. How must life be like for these people right now? Can we dare to picture this in our community at a much larger scale, or even in our families? Now, going back to the detonation, an effect that has become increasingly relevant, much more so than in 1945, is the electromagnetic pulse that results from a nuclear detonation. This pulse would disrupt the electricity supply grid and electronic equipment and systems. Electronic communications would fail, likely having a major impact on the global economy. All forms of international travel, such as planes and trains, would likely be disrupted indefinitely. Moreover, a nuclear explosion at a high altitude would create an electromagnetic pulse capable of disrupting most electrical devices within a radius that is far greater than the physical devastation caused by the nuclear blast. This would cause a widespread failure of automobiles, computers, telephones, and telecommunications. Basically, the world as we know it would radically change. Now, no meaningful medical or disaster relief response to a nuclear detonation would be possible. For most medical facilities, such as hospitals and clinics, would be destroyed or disabled, and essential supplies would be unavailable. Roads and other communication infrastructure would also be destroyed, making it impossible to transport and attend injured survivors. Most healthcare workers would be killed or severely injured, and dangerous levels of radiation would prevent emergency responders from entering affected areas. This means that victims with injuries, burns, and the painful manifestations of acute radiation syndrome would be left to suffer and die alone. Nuclear weapon detonations also have extreme and long-lasting environmental consequences. Climate scientists have alerted of the consequences of a regional nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan, two neighboring nuclear countries that have had several conflicts since the 1940s. If this conflict were to involve only 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs, this is less than half of their arsenals. It would not only kill and injure millions of people in Central Asia, but the soot and debris that would rise to the atmosphere would severely disrupt the global climate and agriculture for over 20 years. This climate disruption would affect the harvest times of staple grains, that is, rice, wheat, corn, and soy, and the ensuing food shortage would result in a famine that would kill around 2 billion people worldwide, most of whom would be far away from where the original conflict took place. Now, this famine would also trigger social unrest and violent conflict, both within and between nations, increasing the likelihood of a large-scale nuclear war. The thousands of nuclear weapons possessed by the US and Russia would bring about a large-scale devastation, hundreds of millions of casualties, and a nuclear winter, which would destroy the essential ecosystems on which life depends. Agriculture would suddenly stop. Human civilization would be extinguished. Ecosystems would collapse, and many species, perhaps even our own, would become extinct. Now, this dramatic scenario is not a theoretical possibility. It is a reality that we have escaped from by mere chance. The doomsday clock, kept by the renowned Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since 1947, is a symbolic clock that measures the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe in minutes to midnight. Midnight being the total and catastrophic destruction of the world as we know it. In 1963, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a time when bomb drills were carried out regularly in schools, and many people built bombshells in their backyards, the doomsday clock was at 12 minutes to midnight. In 1984, at the height of the Cold War, the doomsday clock was at 3 minutes to midnight. But in 1991, 1 year after the Cold War was declared to be over, the risk dropped to 17 minutes to midnight. Today, when few people are giving nuclear weapons a second thought, the doomsday clock is at 100 seconds to midnight, the highest risk in history. This is largely due to the instability of current leaders of nuclear weapon states and their willingness to threaten with nuclear annihilation, to the worsening of the global climate crisis and its potential for creating and aggravating regional conflicts, and perhaps most importantly, to the ever-growing risk of accidental use of nuclear weapons. In his book, Command and Control, author Eric Schlosser reveals that in the United States alone, there have been 1,000 accidents with the US nuclear arsenals. And on 7 occasions that we know of, the world has been at the brink of a full-scale nuclear war by accident. Of the global arsenal of 13,500 nuclear warheads, approximately 1,800 remain in a state of high alert, pointing at cities ready to be detonated within minutes. These alert systems have mistaken storm clouds, weather balloons, or flocks of geese for incoming nuclear missiles. The ever-growing reliance on automation has made these alert systems increasingly vulnerable to cyber terrorism and to human and technical error. In the end, nuclear weapons are machines. And as we all know from our daily experiences with machines, they eventually fail. Every single machine eventually fails. The risk is thus that scientists from the Future of Life Institute have determined that the most likely nuclear war will be an accidental one. If we are alive today, it is not due to good management of the nuclear arsenals. It is due to luck. Now, how willing are we to bet that this luck will last forever? Can we continue to cross our fingers and hope for the best? Another aspect that is particularly appalling, especially in these times of pandemic, is nuclear spending, the estimates of which point to being as high as $116 billion a year. The United States alone is set to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years on the maintenance and modernization of these weapons. Okay, so at this point, let's recap. We have staggering evidence of the terrible consequences. Many people have suffered and continue to suffer because of these weapons. The scientific community has agreed on the threat they represent and on the terrible risk they pose. And they are terribly expensive. Moreover, nuclear weapons are not practical. Their effects cannot be controlled. They do not respect borders. They are not made to destroy military targets, but to destroy cities and kill many civilians. Using them would likely end up in a nuclear war. So it would be a suicidal act. So they cannot actually be used in warfare. So why do they still exist? Why are there so many people interested in defending the continued reliance of nuclear weapons in security? Going back to their very conception, the fact that some have aspired or continue to aspire to become nuclear powers is a response to the needs set by a system of structural, social, cultural, racial, and gender violence. Allow me to explain. Let us consider, for instance, the genocidal nature of these weapons. To even consider the possibility of destroying an entire nation of people who are not our people, but rather the others, is an acute expression of racism and xenophobia. Nuclear weapon states and their allies, a clear minority in the international community, have, for 75 years, ignored the pleas from the rest of the world, and have also ignored their own disarmament obligations. Currently, those who have nuclear weapons have a special right to possess them and define themselves as responsible states. This, of course, implies that the other countries are not responsible countries and cannot be trusted with the magical red button. That power is a privilege reserved for a selected group. But can we really call them responsible? These are the countries that have detonated their nuclear bombs over peaceful indigenous populations, which, by the way, continue to be affected to this very day and have not yet been provided with inadequate assistance. Can we really use the word responsible to describe countries that do not address the current risk, that ignore or even hide evidence? Countries that spend ludicrous amounts of money in maintaining this existential threat at a time, such as today, when due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the world's resources are spread so thin? Of course not. The use of this word, responsible, is rather a euphemism for privilege. And, well, this is, of course, a colonialist attitude, one we see even within the United Nations. For instance, over recent years, a clear majority of nations has been supportive of humanitarian arguments and of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And most of said countries are mainly from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and Southeast Asia. So, when referring to the TPNW and to any of the humanitarian initiatives, the nuclear weapon states and their allies often refer to these countries' viewpoints with condescension and disdain, calling them naive, irrational, emotional, and irresponsible. Some opinions count, the global north, and others, well, not so much, the global south. In fact, if we look at where nuclear weapons have been used and tested, it is clear that in the nuclear grand scheme of things, some people matter more than others. Moreover, during the many political steps towards the TPNW and beyond, some delegates from Caribbean and African nations were approached by nuclear weapon states and were asked to abstain from participating in negotiations. They were explicitly told to abstain from voting in favor of the prohibition in order to avoid possible consequences. Thus, we can see how imperialism is still very much alive today in power dynamics that are at play in international politics. However, and especially when it comes to nuclear weapons, there is also a strong gender charge. Let us first consider the disproportionate impact these weapons have on women and girls, both biologically and socially. Women have much higher rates of cancer, such as breast cancer. They have a higher risk of genetic damage and congenital malformations in their offspring, and are the ones suffering from the pregnancy and birth of children with drastic malformations, which is something that poses a severe psychological trauma. But it is also women who suffer the most from the stigma of being defective, contaminated, or infectious due to radiation. It renders them unmarriable, and this is particularly relevant in societies where women need to be married to be able to function in their daily lives, to be able to function socially, and where being single is a socioeconomic tragedy for a woman. On the other hand, let us consider the enormous symbolic charge of nuclear weapons, of strength, protection, and the power to deter through a material force. Nuclear weapons are the epitome of the phrase, might is right. One such example is when President Donald Trump tweeted in January of 2018, referring to Kim Jong-un, that I too have a nuclear button, but it is much bigger and more powerful than his, and my button works. Obviously, he was alluding to something that is often measured and compared. But if you think that one could not get any less subtle, we can look at what the most prominent Indian politician stated in 1998 when India carried out 3 nuclear weapons tests. He said, "We had to prove to the world that we are not eunuchs." After all, real men make tough decisions. Real men are not emotional. We can thus see how the ideas on masculinity and femininity are important, not only in our very perception, but also in international politics and in strategic nuclear thinking, in what we think is strong or weak, rational or emotional, credible or unreliable, realistic or unrealistic. Hence, it is easier for some of us, perhaps most of us, to believe that we are safer with nuclear weapons than without them. This magical power of nuclear deterrence, the threat of one nuclear nation to destroy everything if attacked, particularly, but not exclusively, with other nuclear weapons, is essentially the reason for being of nuclear weapons. It is their main justification and the reason why they are still associated to security. However, for this nuclear deterrence to work, it needs to disregard many things. It needs to disregard the risks, it needs to disregard the expense, it needs to disregard the harm these weapons have caused and continue to cause to so many people and the environment. It needs to disregard the times it has not worked. And it needs for everyone to believe that it is perfect and will work forever, and that a deterrent is always necessary to keep countries from fighting one another. It needs people to believe that security is only obtained through force or through the capacity and willingness to use force. In sum, the sole reason for possessing nuclear weapons is the semantic charge behind the words nuclear power and nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons thus function, in this sense, as a symbol, the construction of which has been carefully crafted over time. From the censorship of the hibakusha to the Miss Atomic bomb pageants, this has involved propaganda and consistent media involvement. And the entire world has bought into this. This is how we ended up with 9 nuclear weapon states. And through action or omission, the entire world has supported and upheld the symbolic power of nuclear weapons and placed them on a pedestal. That is, until recently. On July the 7th of 2017, at the United Nations headquarters in New York, 122 countries, a clear majority of the international community, voted in favor of adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. This treaty prohibits the development, the testing, production, stockpiling, stationing, transfer, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. Basically everything related to nuclear weapons. This treaty aims to stigmatize nuclear weapons through prohibition, a strategy that history has proven to be effective, and the process whereby all other weapons of mass destruction have been abolished. Now, for those skeptics out there, let me tell you that the United States never signed the Convention Against Cluster Munitions or the Landmine Ban Treaty. Yet, it no longer produces any of these weapons of mass destruction. Why? Well, because it ran out of buyers and investors, and a global climate of moral condemnation had exerted pressure and made it politically unfavorable to continue producing them. Currently, there are no states that boast of being a chemical weapons power, or that use biological weapons in their security doctrines. We would find that unthinkable. This is because a strong international norm and a climate of moral condemnation have made such claims taboo. And this is precisely how this treaty is already starting to take effect. Now, getting to the ban was not an easy process. It took much insistence and the commitment of brave and consistent voices who came together to defy the world's strongest military and economic powers. The ban was possible because we changed the narrative. By focusing the discussion on the humanitarian consequences, nuclear weapons were no longer seen just as strategic military assets, but as threats to humanity. The TPNW is the result of the collective empowerment of non-nuclear weapon states and of them assuming an active role as stakeholders in the nuclear weapons issue. This refreshing new way of conducting international politics, coined by a Costa Rican diplomat as the democratization of nuclear disarmament, fosters cooperation and strengthens the multilateral regime. And these are necessary ingredients to effectively face humanity's pressing challenges. Nowadays, power and prestige are less associated to destructive power and positions and threats, and ever more associated to the ability to create dialogue, build bridges, and come to agreements. The threats of imminent nuclear war makes less sense than ever right now. And in light of the world's current crisis, spending the yearly sum of $116 billion on nuclear weapons is just absurd. It is urgent to give peace a chance. It is urgent to bring evidence and common sense to the center stage. It is urgent to move towards nuclear disarmament. and ban nuclear weapons. So, how do we go about this? How do we help in making the TPNW a global reality? Well, certainly fostering a democratic, participative culture is part of the solution. This implies making sure that all voices matter and that no voices are left behind. If we work actively towards eliminating racism, sexism, and all other forms of systemic oppression and discrimination, we are also weakening the nuclear hegemony. However, we need to address the nuclear issue directly. The urgency of nuclear disarmament requires that we face this problem head on. And there's so much we can do. Now, the most direct action, short of becoming a state leader, is joining a campaign and generating political will, or helping to generate political will. And this does not have to happen at the central government level. We can, for instance, ask our members of parliament to support the treaty and ask them to sign ICANN's parliamentarian pledge. We can also ask the municipalities of our towns and cities to sign the ICANN Cities Appeal and support the TPNW, both at the local level and politically with the central government. And this particular campaign has been tremendously effective. And cities such as Barcelona, Paris, Milan, Oslo, Berlin, Washington, D.C., LA, and many others have already joined. Support for the treaty, for the ban, is building. What we're really after, though, what is required for nuclear abolition, is a paradigm shift. We need a social movement that will bring this change into effect. It was almost a year ago, during the March Against Violence Against Women, when a group of Chilean activists carried out a powerful performance that went viral and that was reproduced throughout the world. In it, they chanted in Spanish, "El violador eres tú." The rapist is you, the rapist is you. They were, of course, not only speaking to the rapist himself, but calling on people to reflect in what ways they had themselves contributed to this rape culture and enabled the heinous act of rape. And with this reflection came the realization that even those of us who consider ourselves to be good guys have been a part of this in one way or another. In the times when we partook or laughed at a sexist joke, or even when we didn't, but failed to say anything, we were also being a part of it. Our silence spoke volumes. Likewise, with the very related issue of nuclear weapons, every time we refer to nuclear weapon states as nuclear powers, every time we validate deterrence, and even when we say absolutely nothing, we are enabling nuclear hegemony. Nuclear weapons are not inevitable. They are not a natural disaster. They are machines created by humans, and humans can stop them. Humans must stop them. If we think about it, our very existence is being threatened by rhetoric. Now, whether we want it or not, through our actions, through our voice, or through our silence, we are shaping our reality. And not just our immediate reality, but our global reality. The interconnectedness of our world, especially today, cannot be overestimated. So you don't have to join a campaign or donate money to make a difference. You just have to speak up to help keep the conversation alive, to help people become aware of this issue, to make it as relevant as it deserves to be. Let's not wait for someone in a position of power to act, but rather realize that we are ourselves in a position of power. We all have our megaphones. Let's use them. It is up to us to be an instrument of truth and an instrument of peace. Thank you very much.
Carlos, thank you so much for that talk, in urging us to have our voices heard and for urging us to find hopeful ways to weaken the nuclear hegemony by doing basic things like helping to get rid of racism, or helping us to fight against racism, oppression, poverty, and sexism. I find that a very powerful message, in that I often wonder what I can do in the face of this huge issue of nuclear weapons. It seems so big and out of my control, but this really helped me think about it in a different way. So Carlos, are you there? Are you able to share your video?
I am. Hi, I'm here, but I think you have to enable my video actually.
Okay, let me see here what I can do.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah.
Okay,
There we
great.
go. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, that is a very interesting approach, like the intersectionality of nuclear weapons with so many other causes. Something that was brought to my attention, I'm gonna mention two people directly, Ray Atchison from WILP, from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and Haley Ramsey Jones from SGI, from Socorro Gakkai International, who, by the way, if you're interested in this, well, look them up on YouTube and stuff. They portray this quite directly. And if we look at the intersectionality of nuclear weapons with all these other forms of oppression, we can realize that we're all fighting the same common enemy, right? And the solution is also pretty much the same. It involves education, raising awareness, but it also involves consideration, humanity, love, respect, right? And it is something that we must all participate in. We can all participate in. I mean, sometimes you think, okay, what can I do? This is too big for me, right? But we have to make this relevant. We have to bring it up, post about it, tweet it, Instagram it. By contributing to make this conversation relevant, to keep this conversation alive, we're contributing to bring down the powers that be, the powers that keep this threat above our heads, because we have to realize that this threat is real and it affects all of us. If we imagine what we cherish the most, what we want to protect, our loved ones, our children, our parents. Let's imagine that we must protect them, and we have to do something for that, certainly.
Thank you. Susan asks us, could you remind us how many more nations need to agree to the TPNW before it takes effect? And what happens after that?
All right, so the TPNW, thank you, Susan, for that excellent conversation, because we're almost there, actually. The TPNW, as was agreed during negotiations, needs 50 ratifications in order to enter into force, to become international law. That means that the countries that have signed it, like the signature and ratification are two different processes. Signature is a political commitment, and ratification means that the treaty becomes national law, that the countries, that the Congresses and they legislate and create laws to be able to apply the treaty. So we need 50 countries to ratify in order for the treaty to come into effect. And right now we have 46, we only need 4. And the ratification, we've been following this process quite closely with several countries. And this process, this entry into force is rather imminent. So once the treaty enters into force, then that means that all the countries that are, all the states parties, have to apply it, and this means that this prohibition starts to become an international norm.
Thank you very much. So there's a few more questions coming in on Facebook, so let me move over there. Anne asks, throughout much of the 20th century, developing nations like those in Latin America have aligned their UN votes with the US on many essential issues. Why do you suppose nuclear issues are a topic where economically dependent countries are willing to stand up and stand apart?
It wasn't easy, mind you. Like some countries, for instance, Latin America, even before, there are several treaties involved. In the 60s, there was a lot of movement regarding nuclear weapons. That's when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated in 1968 and came into effect in 1970. But Latin America as a whole, in 1967, negotiated the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which made the whole of Latin America a nuclear weapons-free zone. So we already had that. That was a treaty that banned nuclear weapons in the whole of Latin America. We also, some other regions also joined, making a total of 5 nuclear weapon free zones. But there was certainly political pressure from the United States and directly on some countries, as we were told by some delegates. They had to be brave. I mean, they had to be committed, and having that sort of collective and en bloc protection, en bloc political force in knowing about nuclear weapons, knowing the harm that they have or that they cause, and adopting a group position was definitely key to this. And it was actually through the humanitarian initiative, which dates back to 2010, that was started in actually within the UN. But Norway started a series of conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and this generated a lot of awareness on this issue and a lot of action. And we had to be quite insistent on several diplomats. And when an opportunity opened, well, we fostered it. Because it wasn't easy. Like back in 2013 or even 2014, many countries would not even say openly the word prohibition, because that would mean standing up to the biggest military and economic powers in the world.
I have a question related to that. What kind of economic power, is there a sense that once the ratification goes into effect for the TPNW, is there a sense of the economic power of those initial 50 countries, and can they apply sanctions on nuclear weapons holding countries?
Well, the treaty applies directly to the countries that are part of the treaty. The treaty does not apply to the countries that are not a part of the treaty, at least not directly. So the treaty does have like prohibitions, which are negative obligations, right? You can't do this. And then it has positive obligations, which means caring for the victims and caring for the environment, which is some active things that states can do. But that's within the state, and the state has to find the resources to take care of its own people, which is something that they have to do anyway. So no, they cannot really, like the treaty itself will not apply sanctions to any nations that are outside of it. However, the treaty also doesn't stop any nations from generating any legal action against any other countries. And as the stigmatization grows, as the international norm starts working, because it's already working, as Susie explained yesterday, several pension funds in reaction to the treaty are withdrawing their funds from banks and from financial institutions and from companies associated to nuclear weapons. So it's this stigmatization through, not only through legal mechanisms, but through moral and financial mechanisms is working. So that's the initial phase of where we hope this treaty will be, or is already starting to be effective. But I'll say this: well, Susie explained it yesterday as well, how the nuclear weapon states, when they join the treaty, they'll have to also establish some other mechanisms for getting rid of the weapons themselves.
Thank you. We have a question here that says, once the TPNW takes effect, how do you think this will impact the use of nuclear energy?
So, unfortunately, the inalienable right to use nuclear energy was, as included in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, was also that's something that remained within the TPNW. So, I suppose to the stigmatization, not directly within the TPNW, which does not include any provisions on nuclear energy. And this is important politically because several of the states that champion the prohibition of nuclear weapons own nuclear energy. So they facing, tackling these two issues together would not be politically, strategically wise. However, through the stigmatization that grows with the international norm on nuclear weapons comes also knowledge on the implications of radiation and the implications of nuclear technology. So I suppose in a very indirect manner, the TPNW would help affect nuclear energy, but additional mechanisms are required to stigmatize it as well.
Thank you. A follow-up question from Susan. Does the TPNW affect nuclear weapons states through any aspect of not funding nuclear weapons in nuclear weapons states?
That's a very good question. The treaty and its prohibition, it doesn't prohibit financing nuclear weapons directly, but it does prohibit any assistance. And referring to Susie's presentation yesterday, she did mention, for instance, that Cuba, right, added that explicitly, like financial assistance should be explicitly prohibited. So that is right now quite open, but the treaty does implicitly prohibit financial assistance to nuclear weapons. And that is an interesting topic because we also have, as I mentioned, the ICANN cities appeal. And some cities are quite actively assuming a role almost as if they were little nations in themselves. So they, like all the investments that they have, they are also applying a responsible investment, and they are within their possibilities abstaining from investing in nuclear weapons. So yeah, it's something that within the first meeting of states parties is going to have to be defined explicitly, but implicitly it does. There is a financial prohibition.
We're just about done, but we're at 7:30, but I really want to ask a more sort of philosophical question about democracy. It seems that democracy, the vision or the ideology of democracy, rose in part as a way to diffuse the threat of violence from multiple directions. So in other words, if we allow more input into the process of governance, then there's a less of a threat of imminent violence that will take place against the state in some ways. Like there's always a push and pull here. But with the advent of nuclear weapons, it seems that there is this, you talked about the might making right, right? And so it seems that there is, in the latter half of the 20th century, much less of a need for that sort of consensual aspect of democracy, whether you believe that there's democratic socialism or communism or democratic capitalism, it doesn't matter where you're at with that. It seems that that sort of obliterates any real sense of obligation. I don't know, it's just it was a passing thought, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but thanks for humoring me.
Well, it's an interesting question slash comment, because certainly the whole idea behind nuclear weapons is having a hierarchy of physical power, right? So if you are the most powerful ones, then everybody has to follow your lead, because otherwise, you're going to get it. And that is definitely anti-democratic. So if we're talking about building a culture of multilateralism, of cooperation, that sort of thinking is completely against this. And if we're talking about, like, as I mentioned earlier in the video, we're faced with two existential threats: climate change and nuclear weapons. And what is needed to face climate change, for instance? We need political will. We need collaboration, and we need resources. So $116 billion a year are spent on nuclear weapons. Those resources could be allocated to climate change. All the scientific talent that is also invested in nuclear weapons could also go towards climate change. And the TPNW also strengthens the culture of multilateralism. It was beautiful, actually, to be in the negotiation process of the TPNW, because usually when you go to the UN, there's the countries, when they raise their hands, the delegates, they have these speeches that are pretty much copy-pasted from the year before, and they have 15 minutes, they use 16 or 17 or more, and they drown everything in words. But when they're negotiating in good faith, like the delegates had, say, 15 minutes, they would say, okay, the TPNW needs this and this and this, right? So the statements were incredibly short, and that allowed for a lot of time within the negotiation process to listen to the civil society experts. And there was an entire day where all the delegates were sitting down, and the experts were like going to a university class, something I had never seen before in the UN, like the delegates asking questions to the experts on legal matters, on financial matters, on even health matters. So it was beautiful to see all these people from so many different nations coming together. That is cooperation, and that is what's needed to tackle the climate crisis. So when we talk about this democratic culture that is being built for peace, right? That sort of language about deterrence keeping the peace, which isn't like if we, I mean, we'd have to have an entire week to talk about that particular topic, but that is completely out of the question, completely irrelevant, really. If when we talk about our civilization growing, our real security, this crisis that we are in right now, this pandemic, has shown us that the real security is not in the military, is not in investing in nuclear weapons. It's investing in people, investing in education, investing in health. That's where our real security lies, in togetherness and humanism. And this is how this treaty is fostering. So I'm going to ask, again, to plead to everybody who's listening to be a part of this conversation, to tweet, to follow us at Nuclear Ban on Twitter, ICANN, and repost and be polemic and raise this issue with your family, with your friends, etc. This needs to become relevant. I mean, everybody hears about, say, I don't know, Cardi B, but nobody's really talking about this incredible risk. I mean, let's just imagine all these weapons pointing at us right now. 100 seconds to midnight. That's what the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences says. We're very close to losing absolutely everything. We need to be aware of that. We need for the world to be aware of that.
Thank you. We have a final comment here from Susan that says, what a perfect ending to our time together. Thank you, Carlos, so much. I think that's a great way to end this conversation. If people have additional questions, they can email them to me or put them up on the Facebook feed, and we can find them and relay them to Carlos, or Carlos can go take a look himself. So Carlos, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope that our paths will cross in the future.
I'll make sure of it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's been quite an honor to be a part of this great symposium and to actually be able to close it. It's quite significant. Thank you so much, Tanya, for all your work. It's been truly amazing.
Thank you. Thanks to all those who attended, and we will close out our session now.